Good afternoon. My name is Bill Anderson, and I would firstly like to thank Hub for having me participate in this conference. It's important for all of us right now to share our information and our experiences so that we can learn from each other, because as people say, we are in this together and we're going to make it through this together, but we do have to share our own perspectives. My perspective is as an employment and labor lawyer, and I've been doing that for about 30 years. And so the fundamentals of what I'm going to speak about haven't really changed, but obviously the context of the legal issues has changed pretty remarkably in the last 2 months. So I am going to discuss what I've referred to in the slide that you see as health, safety, and survival. And I don't mean to be too cheeky about the question of survival, because it's primarily what we're talking about is a health and safety concern with people returning back to the workplace during this global pandemic. And of course, people are going to be returning during the pandemic and not after the pandemic, because it is going to continue on for the foreseeable future. The word survival I've chosen not so much for the purpose of the employees and the workers, although that is important because in many of these situations, it is a life or death question for the individuals and for their family members. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the protocols for returning people to work. But it's also the survival of the business, because in this context, we've got businesses that are fundamentally crippled by the pandemic because there is no revenue source or there's no ability to continue to working in this context. And so we're now seeing an increased level of insolvencies, and I expect that to continue. So what we really want to concentrate on, in my opinion, as we go through this process, is the health and safety of the people that you're responsible for as employers and the business that you're responsible for, to make sure that those work together so that everyone survives this pandemic and the crisis that we have. So that's my perspective. I'm going to continue on with the discussion. Obviously, in many of these types of seminar situations, there is interaction with people. We don't have that today, and that's challenging for both of us. If someone needs to contact me to follow up with questions or concerns they might have with respect to the presentation or otherwise, my contact information is available, my phone number and email, and people shouldn't hesitate to contact me if they need to speak with me more. So the first area, I'm going to talk about sort of going through the process and the agenda that we have for this discussion. And I'm going to try to sort of bridge through the start of this situation, which was about 2 months ago, and then through various aspects of the legislation that are affecting decisions along the way. So the first thing that I've mentioned, Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act of Ontario. And I'm an Ontario lawyer, and so my perspective is Ontario, but there is similar legislation in all of the provinces in Canada. So you go to your own legislation to deal with sort of what the government is doing and how they're doing it. The first sort of most important piece of legislation is Occupational Health and Safety Act and what that requires employers to do. The next most important, or possibly equally as important, is the Employment Standards Act of the various provinces. And again, differences in every province, but a fundamental similarity with respect to the obligations of employers to employees. The Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, I'm going to talk about that because it's an income replacement, as I am going to talk about the employee wage and rent subsidies. Rent subsidies aren't really my bailiwick, but I want to talk about the last thing in the slide presentations, integrating all of the above in a dynamic context. In other words, how do we properly get those businesses running again when we're seeing subsidies from various other agencies, and how does that work with the timing? And so I think the rent subsidy and the wage subsidies are important to talk about in that context. So the first area that I previously indicated is the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act of Ontario. And as we know, in mid-March, it was March the 17th in Ontario, the government announced that there was a state of emergency in the province. Every province has their own declaration with respect to a state of emergency and what that means. Now, as a result, we're making decisions, the governments are making decisions in real time by ministerial order. So the premier in the province of Ontario, the various other premiers get together with their cabinet and they make decisions with respect to how the society and employers, from my perspective, are going to operate on a go-forward basis in order to protect the entire society from the spread of the COVID-19. And so what happened was almost immediately in the province of Ontario, the premier and cabinet ordered a shutdown of all non-essential services or businesses. That happened on or about March the 23rd. There was a bit of delay, and then the list got readjusted on April the 3rd and shrunk because there was some criticism with respect to some of the businesses that were permitted to stay open. And in fact, some of the businesses struck you as odd that they would be permitted to stay open. I think at the initial list, nail salons were entitled to stay open, and that changed pretty dramatically. The one driving force with respect to the change in the list is also the construction industry, because what was happening in construction is that there's essential construction and then other construction that people saw as non-essential, which was subdivision construction and other areas of residential construction, which it's important because people can be left without homes. But on the other hand, it wasn't necessarily important to remain open at the time that everyone was panicking with respect to the pandemic. And so unions put some pressure on the government to try to collapse that list down, which they did, as I said, on April the 3rd. And those businesses that were deemed to be essential, mostly for the purpose of maintaining public health and the supply chain, remained open. Now, that left two other types of businesses that we're going to really concentrate on, because those are the businesses that are going to be required to gradually reopen in the next, hopefully, it sounds like in the next month, we're going to see a gradual increase in the number of businesses that get to open. So the two types of businesses that I see in those two groupings are businesses that continue to be open, but that were running off-site. So, for example, your white-collar businesses, advertising, promotion, law offices, accounting offices, those types of businesses essentially shut down, even if they weren't required to shut down. They shut down because it was in the best interest of both the employer and the broader sector to have people working from home. And most of us have the ability, much like today, to sit in our basements or wherever and conduct business offsite without breaching any social distancing protocols. So that's what those businesses have done. But of course, all of those employees are now off-site, and they are maintaining their own schedules as they think appropriate, and struggling from day to day to try to be as productive as possible. But it gets harder and harder as people get de-incentivized because of sort of the things that are going on around them. So it's hard to manage that process, but they're continuing. At some point, we're going to bring those people back into the workplace. And then there are the businesses that have closed down entirely. So that's practically the entire retail sector. And they're closed down, and those people are off-site, and they're not working at all. And so there are income supplements for those people. Now, during the first week that we saw the state of emergency and the change to sort of who was entitled to be open and not, what happened was that employers immediately went into discussions about layoffs, wage reductions, and terminations. So they're thinking forward, how are we going to sort of protect our minimal cash flow, because everyone's business almost, pulled back, and the revenues were compromised. And so employers talked about layoffs. And the thing that is important with respect to the issue of layoffs is the timing and how long those layoffs can continue. In Ontario, we have two thresholds for temporary layoffs at 13 weeks and at 35 weeks. And 13-week layoffs are deemed to be a termination of employment once you surpass that 13-week period, if you do not continue any form of benefit or subsidy to the employee to try to keep that employee engaged with the business. If you do that, you can extend the layoff to 35 weeks. And again, the other provinces have slightly different variations of those requirements, but they all have those types of requirements. And so you got to keep your eye, now that we're into month 3, are we now approaching that 13-week period, and are we in risk of having employees deemed to be terminated, and should we then be continuing benefits if we haven't, in order to elongate that period if we can't get people back to work? There's a whole other issue with respect to layoffs and whether or not they are legally permissible if you don't reserve a contractual right to lay off employees. And we are going to have to deal with that at some point when we're calling people back, because people may say effectively that layoff was a termination and you will severance. We have been counseling employers to sort of worry about that down the road, not become overly concerned about the statutory and common law requirements for layoffs, because people recognize that there is a global emergency. Everyone needs to be responsive to that, both employees and employers. And I don't think judges are going to overly harshly criticize employers for using the right, the statutory right to lay off, where they might not otherwise have reserved that right. The other issue that we looked at immediately following the declaration of emergency was wage reductions. And so people started contemplating, what do we need to do in order to survive in this business? And two, what's fair and appropriate for employees? Historically, if you were looking at a wage reduction of anything more than 10%, which was unilaterally imposed, it might constitute the constructive termination of someone's employment. And so initially employers were looking at 10, 15%, but many employers have gone much beyond those numbers, up to 50% in some cases. And from my experience, most employees have accepted a certain level of reduction of their wages during this period, and many have agreed in writing that they're prepared to accept a decrease in their wages. We may see that change at some point in the future when we bring them back, so employers need to be conscious about how they transition those people back to work and what they do with respect to wages. Do they increase them immediately? There may not be the cash flow in order to do that. And how do you communicate that message to your employees? And the other thing that we have to be very careful about as employers and employer counsel is that we make it clear, if it's a reduction, temporary reduction in salary, that it's not a deferral of that income until the business is up and running again. Because there will be very few businesses that are able to catch up on those wages because the revenue sources aren't. They don't exist for that period of time. So the communication around that has to be, it's a temporary reduction, hopefully knock wood, of the salaries. It's not a deferral, and we'll get everyone back up to their pre-existing salaries as soon as we can. And then, of course, the termination issue is that you terminate someone, you are going to then trigger an obligation to either provide notice of termination, payment in lieu of notice of termination, and severance, and what employers are doing with those payments as they accrue now without the cash flow, and what they're going to do in the future when they're making decisions about who's coming back when. So the first piece of legislation that I want to talk about are the protected leaves under the Employment Standards Act, and specifically the infectious disease emergency leave, which was a pre-existing leave, but it was amended in 2020 to deal specifically with COVID-19. And so 2020, there's an amendment, there's a recognition that there is going to be leaves of absence that are created by virtue of COVID-19. They're unlimited duration. They deal with yourself or a family member either being diagnosed with COVID-19 or having to self-isolate, either because you're returning from a trip or you have symptoms or a family member has symptoms. And then the big issue is childcare obligations. So with childcare obligations, no one's at school now, and so a parent is going to have to stay home to care for a younger child and not go to work. And those reasons and explanations for not being able to attend at work, either for essential business now or later on down the road when we bring people back, that's a legitimate leave. And it's a legitimate request of an employee to say, I can't return to work because of one of these reasons that's enumerated under this infectious disease emergency leave. But you also have to remember that there are many other leaves of absences that are recognized in the Employment Standards Act of Ontario and other legislation, as I said: sick leave, family caregiver leave, medical leave, critical illness leave, and emergency medical leave, family emergency leave, and the last thing I'm going to talk about is reprisals. But these leaves range from 3 days for a sick leave up to 37 weeks if you have a critically ill child. And there are other there are ranges for, family medical leave if someone looks like they may have their health compromised to the point where they may pass. People are entitled to take those leaves. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a real conflict when we're asking people to come back. When we have employees that are entitled to these leaves, they're not going to come back. And they're going to stay off. And there's nothing that you can do about it because, of course, there are reprisal issues if you start to discipline, terminate, suspend employees because they are electing to take these leaves and enforcing their acts under their rights under the Employment Standards Act. And so employers have to be very cautious when employees say, I cannot return to work right now because of one of these job-protected leaves, or I'm afraid to come back to work because I think it may compromise my health. And so that issue is going to be more complicated because you, as an employer, are going to ask the employee to explain why the leave is necessary. And if it is just a concern with respect to potential health problems, then we're going to address that as an Occupational Health and Safety Act issue. We also have the problem that people are at home right now and they are receiving EI, they're receiving CERB, or they're receiving some other form of income replacement. And there may be a disincentive for employees to return to work, which they think may compromise their health or that of a family member. And so they're going to dig their heels in. Now, on the reverse side of that issue, you've got employers that are looking at these people thinking, I don't think everyone's coming back to work. People are on layoff or they're under this their obligation not to attend at work right now because of the declaration of an emergency. And so we've now looked and retooled our workplace. We've started to look at our revenues down the road, and we've decided that we don't need all of these people to come back. So what employers are going to have to be very careful about is that when they're looking at the lists of people who are coming back and not coming back, that there is an objective business criteria with respect to that decision, because there is a tendency, or can be a tendency, for employers to look at weak employees and not have them return to the workplace. And then the question is, well, why are they weak? Are they weak because they've taken time because of the infectious disease emergency leave? Are they weak because they were taking care of a family member? Do they have a disability and that's perceived as a weakness for those people? Anytime you have job protected leave or a certain characteristic which would constitute a discriminatory issue acted upon in a termination, then that employer is going to face the consequences of that. So employers need to be careful when they're culling their list of employees that are returning and not returning, that they do not discriminate against anyone on the basis of one of those enumerated heads in the Human Rights Code or Act, depending on where you are, or something in the Employment Standards Act. So employers will be very careful about that. Occupational health and safety. So now we've decided we're going to get people back, and now we have to make sure that they're safe, because we know that every employer has an obligation, regardless of where you are in Canada, to the employees of that employer to make sure that they're safe at work. And workplace is broadly defined. So it's not only sort of where you're sitting in a tower, it's also where you're off at customer sites, when you're traveling, when you're doing other things. And there are jobs that are inherently more dangerous, but for the most part, every employer has an obligation to every employee to make sure that they're safe at work. So that's going to be included in this COVID-19 return to work protocol. And what I would caution everyone to do is to go back to the things that you may have been ignoring before this crisis, like your joint health and safety committee, if you have over 20 employees in the province of Ontario, and again, thresholds will vary, and make sure that those committees are in place, because those people are going to help you with respect to the return to work. And if you have an inspector come in from the Ministry of Labour, the first thing they're going to ask about is, are you in compliance with the Act as it existed before this crisis? So you got a committee, it's going to meet, and it's going to deal with all health and safety issues, including the protocols of how people are going to work when they come back. And why is that so important right now? Well, one, it's important because you want to keep your employees healthy and safe in the workplace, because it's the right thing to do. And why else? Because you are potentially going to have work refusals. So people come back to work, they're a little bit uncomfortable about coming back in any event, but you've said, look, unless you have a justifiable reason for an extended leave of absence, you need to come back to work. We need to get the business running again. And the employee says, it's not safe. Okay, well, then how do you take that up? The supervisor needs to take that up with the employee and try to understand what the safety concerns are. You need to get to the Joint Health and Safety Committee and say, what haven't we addressed in this workplace that we ought to have addressed? And then change it if you haven't done it, so that that employee no longer has reason to complain. And if there is an unresolved issue with the employee, you then need to get an inspector to come from the Ministry of Labour and have that inspector solve the work refusal issue so that people get back to work. So that's why it's important. I've given some of these safety measures that people need to think about. These are examples that we can borrow from the essential businesses that have continued to run, because they have gone through the process now of coming up with lists. You know, you have people continue to work from home, you physically distance in the workplace, you add floor marking. So what they say is there are engineering elements to this and administrative elements to it. The engineering elements are, okay, so put up barriers between desks and workstations, separate tables in lunchrooms, do all of those things that are physically required in the workplace. And then the administrative part is you need to then administer or manage your people so that they know what the rules are and that they adhere to the rules. Sanitize the workplace, educate employees with respect to all of the things that you're going to look at to say, how do I keep people safe in the workplace? And again, you're coming up with these lists with your Joint Health and Safety Committee. One of the frequently asked questions that we have is, well, what do we do when someone exhibits signs of COVID-19 and they're actually diagnosed with COVID-19? And, you know, if that happens, what you need to do is get the person out of the workplace, self-isolate, and you do the contact tracing back to the people where there has been a direct contact with the individual who's tested positive. If someone's showing symptoms, you do not necessarily need to then act upon it with the other employees in the workplace, but you have to then be conscious of the fact that you got someone who may be positive, and you are going to insist that that person get tested, that it's communicated back to the workplace. You're not going to communicate the name of that person, but you're going to deal with any sort of tracing back so that you can isolate that infection and remove it from the workplace so that you do not have an outbreak at your workplace, which will then force you to close down your workplace because you have to advise the Ministry of Health, your local health department, with respect to a positive case, and they're going to come in and investigate. So you want to deal with that. You want to be responsive, you want to be communicative, and you want to try to isolate and contain an outbreak. Section 50 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, I included in this because, again, this is one of those issues that employers have to be very careful about, that if people are complaining about returning to work for legitimate or frankly not legitimate reasons, and they suffer a reprisal, then employers are going to face liability with respect to those reprisals. I've included a slide for Workplace Safety and Insurance Board because if someone contracts COVID-19 at the workplace, that is a compensable claim under workers' compensation legislation. So the real issue there is it something that arose out of the workplace? And there are presumptions in certain workplaces like nursing homes that it probably occurred there. But there will be other cases where someone tests positive and then their coworker tests positive. For sure, the coworker is going to qualify for workers' compensation benefits. And so employers should not discourage applications for workers' compensation because there is a secondary fund that's going to pay those claims. It's not going to be allocated back to the employer, and the employer should make sure that that's a source of money for someone who tests positive because they came in contact with COVID-19 in the workplace. I've got a slide here for the wage, rent, and the EI sort of top-up issues for employees. And the reason why I've included this, of course, many employers have now gone and applied for these funds, and they're supplementing the wages of the employees through these funds. And what people are going to have to do, I'm not going to get into the sort of the dynamics of the actual funds, but employers now need to think about, when I open up, I'm going to have limitations and I'm going to listen to the government directives, and I'm going to open up sort of when I can safely, but I also have to think about the revenue projections that I'm going to have, because I don't want to open up too soon if I can't do it safely, and if I'm going to lose these subsidies because I'm going to start acquiring revenue that disqualifies me from the subsidies, which are going to continue into June. And you want to make sure that that's a balancing act so you can hit the ground running and have sufficient revenue to pay your employees when they come back, and at whatever wages are acceptable to the employees when they come back, so that you have sustainability. Presumably, when that second wave hits, you've sort of thought through, okay, these are the people I need and how I'm going to get through that process. I know it's a lot of information. There's more information that will be available, but that will hopefully sort of trigger people to sort of identify some of these issues as we end up sort of transitioning back the next, hopefully, 4 weeks, and maintaining our workplaces in a health and safety. And I thank you. And of course, if there are questions, people